Hello and welcome to another Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. In this episode, we'll be looking at Ancient Warfare Volume 11, Issue 2, On the Cusp of Empire, the Romans Unify Italy. But before we start, just a quick thank you to those who support us on Patreon each episode. That patronage helps us to put the show together and find the time to record the podcast. But dear listener, there is something else to be thanking our patrons for. They consistently supply us with some top quality talking points each episode. So to find out more, go to patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. I have, of course, been slightly disingenuous. It's also a big thank you to those who follow us on Facebook, as there is a small cadre of followers there who regularly answer the call when we ask for listeners' thoughts on upcoming topics. So to keep up with Ancient Warfare on Facebook, go to facebook.com/AW Magazine. So joining me for this episode, we have Jasper Otage, Murray Darm, Mark DeSantis and Mark McCaffrey. So we're looking at the 4th century BCE. This is the early Roman Republic. How does what we would call Italy, the Italian peninsula, what we now call Italy, the Italian peninsula, look at the start of this period?
Well, strictly speaking, I should refer you to Ancient Warfare issue 401, which is more devoted to all those different peoples. But it's a great big mess, really. You have Celts in the north, Celtic tribes, Etruscans controlling large parts of the middle section. And Rome at the beginning of the 4th century really doesn't control directly very much of Italy yet. Just the central Latium area. And then there's various Italic peoples around there and to their south, and further on to the south and along the coast you have lots of Greek colonist cities. And then there's, various bits and pieces of people here and there mixed in. It's a great big happy variety bunch.
And Jasper, you lament in your introduction to this issue the lack of sources. Yet it's also potentially one of the best illustrated, as there's lots of artifacts, which is obviously illustrations are not good for the podcast. But I mean, what sources do we have to draw upon for this period?
Well, not very many. A lot of people are going to go back to Livy, who's of course writes around the era of the Emperor Augustus, so several centuries afterward, and we have to try and figure out what sources he used to put his stories together. And that's assuming that all the books for that period survive, which they don't. And then there's various Greek authors, Hellenistic authors who describe what's going on. There's fragments from very early Roman historians. But there's a lot of guesswork, but there's very interesting research being done on that era now, which combines archaeology, trying to figure out the archaeology and literature, and trying to patch it all together and see how the development went. And it's extremely hotly debated in academia how Rome goes from this single city state for several centuries, and then at the beginning of the 4th century, that you get Celts come by, they sack Rome, and then it's almost as if as a compensating for the PTSD of that situation. They take a couple of decades to organize themselves and reset things, and then boom, they explode across the peninsula. And trying to figure out what's going on there, just very interesting.
There was an article last week that basically said that there's been some DNA testing on an Etruscan tomb where they could extract some DNA, and Herodotus's origins of the Etruscans were proven by DNA, because the DNA were not related to the other peoples of the Italian peninsula, which was, again, it made it into mainstream newspapers, which are like, that is so unusual for an ancient historical topic that's not involved looting, to actually be on front page news. That Herodotus was right, which again, people will open up debates, and especially anyone who claims that they are descended from the Etruscans to this day, they're going to be very upset if it's non-Italians, but they're Lydians.
I thought I read a DNA thing the other day that says basically we're all related. You don't have to go back more than about 100 years, and everyone's starts to be related to quite quickly to everybody. So. It gets, it's even...
Well, mathematically, it's inevitable.
Yeah. So this is clearly a difficult question, not a difficult question, a contentious question, and it does sort of loop in with one that's been asked from one of our patrons. Patrons support the show, and they can be found, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. Did Rome start to conquer the peninsula? And chairman asks, was it inevitable that the Romans were to control all of Italy? Their gift of geographic location and classic Roman temperament, that's Roman temperament, always seems to be the reasons given. But was this the real case? And we'll get to guns, germs and steel later, so let's keep the two topics separate if we can.
Well, I don't think it was inevitable. I think it's a combination of determination, perseverance, luck. One of the other things, of course, is that the Roman manpower question is that Rome can always find a new army and can always find a good general to lead its men.
Sooner or later, it could go through a few decades of bad generalship and then find someone, but with all the lost armies, it's like, oh well, no, send another army out. Okay, no, send another army out. And I think all of those sorts of things are combined. I think the lack of a unified, no one confederates against it in strength to oppose Rome.
I think at the same time, there's a little bit of a problem in terms of our source material as well here, because we've got a very big Roman bias over this. We don't get as much input from these other cultures that eventually get wiped out. And I think you've got to take into consideration that, okay, Rome does, grow in strength over time, but at the same time, you've got huge numbers of external factors playing into this scenario, be it from the north with the Gauls, be it seaborne activities from Sicily or Carthage over time. You've got what's happening in the east, in the developing successor states in the east for the Greeks and the Hellenistic world. That is also having a knock-on effect with Pyrrhus, etc., eventually, and other things, in terms of troop movements, mercenary activities. All this, it's a combination of factors that give Rome an opportunity, and if they weren't there, or if some of them weren't there, it changes the scenario completely. So, and how much the Romans are capitalizing on this, maybe the sources sort of overplay the Rome just was so good factor.
The manpower thing does seem to be a big one. How easily Rome manages to turn conquered former competitors or enemies into a manpower resource. But then again, we don't know how common this was for other Italian peoples to do with anybody they conquered.
Obviously the sources are all written after it's generally happened, so they can, write with hindsight.
It makes it very easy to get this sort of inevitable idea. All they had to do was to swat some of these bothersome Greeks and other Italic peoples aside, and then they could get going with the real business of Pyrrhus and then Carthage, and bang, there's Rome.
But you're right, though. The catalyst of the sack of Rome in 390, or whenever you date it to, is an amazing sort of kick up the pants, if you like, kick up the skirt of the Romans, because only the effeminate Celts wear trousers. And yeah, it's an amazing sort of, oh gosh, if we can't join them, we better beat them then.
I think that the sack of Rome was a psychic wound that turned out to be a vast strength for the Romans, because they became so determined never to let that happen again.
Well, it's amazing. It's amazing how long they refer to it. You know, they can be.
It truly is. It's national PTSD almost.
Yeah, and you know they're referring to it in the Cimbri and the Teutones. You know, in the early 100s. So 290 years later, you can refer to this event. And we don't have that. When people talk about the U.S. Civil War, that's still not that far away. That's not that long ago. And I suppose, if we're talking about the Napoleonic Wars as being formative of anyone today, that's still not as far away. No one's talking about the
There's one. I can think of one. Gibraltar. Okay,
there you go. So there are other similarities, but for most of us it feels very, that's such a long way away, and it's not formative for who we are. I mean, I'm a New Zealander. My country only came into existence in 1840, so that's kind of inconceivable.
Well, one thing you said earlier, Murray, you said, they didn't might not have had a good general for 10 to 20 years. Well, in 10 to 20 years now is quite a long time, but when you're looking through your long lens of history, that's 10 to 20 years is forever. But actually, the war could have been over and done with, and you've been conquered and lost. In reality, in your now fixed timeline.
The Samnite Wars are sometimes considered as one more or less continuous period, and then you're talking about something like 60-something years of a single war fought in an area, a couple hundred square miles.
You could almost then push the First War or the Second World War together. I wonder if in 2,000 years' time they go, well, that war between Britain and Europe, and they've pushed it all together, and that's what you see.
Well, we do that. We do that with the wars of religion, with the 30 Years' War and the wars of the Spanish Succession. We lump them together. The 100 Years' War. They're like, oh, it's too complicated. Yeah, the 100 years. And it's longer than 100 years. Yeah, but we'll call it the 100 Years' War. And even the Peloponnesian War, we call it the Peloponnesian War. There's a period of peace in the middle, and there's, different wars, but we go, it's too complicated. So it could well just be the 20th century gets lumped in as one giant war, which wouldn't actually be inaccurate. But I think the other thing, of course, is that because it's generally seasonal, and you're going out and fighting every year, you can refight over the same piece of territory, which is kind of traditional and very, very way that the city-states of Greece used to do. But I think that's where the temperament question comes in, that if Rome breaks a treaty, it's fine. But if you break a treaty against Rome, somehow that's some criminal act that needs to be punished forever. And that's that attitude and determination, let's refight over the strip of land that we want to add to our estates. It's like, well, it's not like you can plough it. Well, I suppose you can. We'll wait till we've ploughed it, and we'll wait till we've sown the crops, and we'll wait till we've actually harvested the crops, then we'll fight over it.
Are these city-states that Rome's fighting against?
I think we're not entirely clear on what kind of political structure like the Samnites are. Some people say they're mountain tribes, and that doesn't seem to be right at all.
The traditional textbooks seem to always keep saying that it's city-states, but I think the more you sort of look at it, the more you can sort of read between the lines and see that there are actually competing federations out there of not too dissimilar, an idea to what's happening in Latium. But they are later on overplaying Rome got together this unity within Latium and grew from there. But at the same time, Tarentum, that can be that could have been a equally prosperous little federation as such, if it had gone distance.
I think there are city-states, and there are city-states that control territory, and there are other forms of organisation that we don't know a lot about. Because the city-states, whether it be in Sicily or even when they call in Pyrrhus, that they are city-states that are asking these for intervention. but they must control territory. But how they do it and how they organise themselves.
Well, you've also got the 9 cities in Etruria who form that federation there, and but again, in terms of what exactly the government was, determination of who was actually on top as such is a little bit vague.
All back to source material not telling us anything.
Couldn't they have left some more?
Yeah. Well, this new reading of the Herculaneum Library by scanning the crushed and
we got another poet, I think, wasn't it? Or
I think poets and philosophers. So hopefully there's a history text thrown in there somewhere. But
Jasper mentioned before about endless manpower and persuading Rome's enemies, conquered enemies, to fight for them. I mean, I wondered if this idea of Romanization, once Roman gets control, that gets trooped about, once we get control, we can see how fantastic Rome is, and we want to fight for them. Or we buy into this idea of Rome, or at this point are people being strong armed into it, or is Rome having to police areas with its forces?
And I think probably you'll find that the sources say that they made a treaty with Rome and then they became Roman allies, gladly and willingly. Sure.
Yep. Until centuries later, they suddenly weren't glad and willing, and the revolt.
And they had a war.
Happened there? Yeah.
There's a broad brush of Romanization. Then they saw the light.
It certainly seems that the Romans were able to at least adhere some peoples of Italy to their cause, with various degrees of willingness. Because if I compare the Romans, who stood at the head of a confederation that would largely stay loyal to it during the Punic Wars, I compare them to the Carthaginians, where the Carthaginians did not invoke the same sort of loyalty among the various Phoenician peoples of North Africa.
But there's a much clearer ethnic divide there between the Carthaginians and their allied states as such, whereas the Romans, they're not absolutely the same culture across Italy, but they're related. They're a little bit more homegrown than the Carthaginians.
I agree to a certain extent, because the Carthaginians obviously are descended from Phoenician colonists, but there were several other Phoenician cities in North Africa that were still kept at arm's length, were never actually fully embraced, let into the fold by the Carthaginians themselves. It was very much, this is the Carthaginian empire where the ruling class and everybody else is a subject state. I also would compare the Romans to both the Athenians and the Spartans. The Spartans were famous for having a lot of difficulty in allowing anybody else into Sparta on even a somewhat equal footing. The Athenian Empire itself was really all about Athens and its subject states in the Aegean, whereas it seems that the Romans, once again, not to draw this too far, but were able to convince at least the elites of enough of these various states in central Italy to become part of the Roman project, that they became more often than not loyal allies. And once again, they stood by Rome during the dark years of the Punic Wars when Hannibal was in Italy. So it would seem that they managed to do something different.
Yeah, on the other hand, a cynic might say, well, maybe some of those cities, or some of those elites sort of gauged the likely outcome of that war and were like, well, if we switch to Hannibal now and Rome wins, that won't be very much fun.
Hannibal's all the way over in North Africa, and we're stuck with an unhappy Rome in the same peninsula. So, yeah, I think it's interesting though, because I think Rome does, Rome on the whole does make a good master, so to speak. And we don't know this. We don't know the conditions under which Rome became the master, but they clearly weren't regarded as oppressive as other examples, like, even Syracuse and Sicily wasn't a good master to the other city-states. Athens obviously wasn't. Sparta famously wasn't.
It'd be interesting to know if other cities or confederations had these legalistic ways of incorporating other peoples into their polity. I mean, how the Romans seem to be fairly generous with at least basic citizen rights or basic Roman rights for new foreign members of their alliance, which of course famously the Greeks very much do not do. You have to wonder if that made a difference in the long run, and it would be interesting to know if, say, the Samnites or Campanian city-states did the same thing. If there was an Italian tradition or a uniquely Roman invention.
Yeah, well, that's become the trend in modern ancient history, is to give everything Roman to someone else in the Italian peninsula. So almost, nothing is Roman. It's all taken from the Etruscans or from the Latins or someone else. Even their language.
So am I right in saying that the Roman army, as it were, or the troops, were not paid as a standing army? They were paid in plunder? Could I read that correctly in the magazine? It's believed.
It's still a militia army, so there's no standing army anyway.
So if you're paying people in plunder, does that essentially mean to have any form of incentive for people to fight, you have to keep them fighting?
Well, is that Harris? Famous argument that the Roman Republic becomes sort of a self-expanding sort of organism because they have to. They have to get the plunder, and they have to keep this system going of capturing new things.
If you're surrounded by the enemy, and you've got to defend the passes, and you're not going to pay people anything but plunder, offense becomes your only defense, surely.
It sounds very Roman. We accidentally captured everything because we had to. It was defensive.
Yeah. But you also get that and we're still in the age when the sources are writing of the citizen soldier, the farmer who farms and then goes and becomes a soldier out of patriotism and nationalistic duty, and then goes back to farming. We're still in that age where later writers talk about this is what it is. But of course they are writing in the age of professional standing armies. And so I think there is a romanticization of that, but that argument of, the perpetuation of plunder is valid.
Or are we being too cynical about nationalism fever being rife in Rome and them going out and saying, right, our duty as citizens is, and I'm just meaning like, if you look at some of the government structures later on in little cities attached to the Roman Empire eventually, more and more of them are, you look at them and they involvement in local government, for example, in somewhere like Pompeii, you have people who aren't actually doing it because there's a monetary benefit to it. Actually, it's a deficit. You've actually got to pay to be involved in your local government in Pompeii in 1st century AD, and should that be transferred back to the these wars that we're talking about, and say actually they weren't as money and plunder driven as we might assume.
That's kind of, I thought that was really interesting. That came out of the issue sort of as a whole, and that has come about because of an interpretation of all that artwork that we found in those graves. This emphasis on sort of glory by defeating your enemy, that seems to have been a Southern Italian. Certainly from Rome further south, and if you look at Etruscan, ash boxes, it seems to certainly be there too. they seem to have had a very strong, ethos, the warrior ethos, which probably made, a call to arms a lot more easy.
There's also that odd thing if you said to you said to the populace, do you want to go and fight and there's potentially plunder? If a certain string of them are perfectly adequately fed and well off, do they want to go? In which case, do you get the people who can afford to go because they've got time to go, and they're put in almost like an underclass who go, well, my life's poor, but it'll be better if I go and do that. And there must be a sort of I don't like to use the word middle class. It's probably not what I'm really driving at. There must be some perfectly comfortable people off farming in agriculture, various other things, who have a good, steady income that wouldn't particularly be interested in going to fight. At which point you have to have a large that economy must be able to afford a large, almost underclass who are keen to go.
Maybe I think anybody who could afford to sort of had to. Or be looked upon by his neighbors as a coward, probably. I think that warrior ethos is very important, and if you want to get ahead in life in Rome, I'm sure you couldn't be known as somebody who shirked his duties.
Yep. I think the other thing, of course, is that plunder does allow social mobility in a much faster way than working at your plough, because if you get a decent amount of plunder, you can suddenly be in the next class up because you can afford the arms and the armor. But there's also that trending that to be renowned in society, there are certain behaviours you must undertake, including being a warrior and going to serve and fighting well, and that's all in the poetry about what we emphasise and who is a good man. And even the idea of virtus in Roman culture comes from the soldierly aspect. So that's a big part of it. So I think that is emphasised, and so therefore being a soldier who can do what soldiers do from whatever class you happen to be from is a big part of service, if you like.
Well, to move on. Nicholas from Facebook asked what I thought might be an interesting question. There's an idea out there that Rome created an empire through self-defense, and that they always tried to have some kind of casus belli justification before starting a war. To what extent do you think that the Romans at this time actually cared about a casus belli, or was this idea a creation of later writers to justify the empire?
I think I've said this before, but in a previous edition we looked at the Fetiales priesthood and their involvement in this whole declaration of war, giving your warning over a period of 30 days, and after 33 days of 3 warnings being given, it was then declared that they had the justified right to launch a war on behalf of the gods to seek justice. But it does come through, I think, in Livy that there are Etruscan Fetiales priests. I think is it Etruscan or it's either Etruscan or Lucanian, and that it's not just a Latin or Roman idea. It is something that there seems to be a suggestion that this is a concept that is doing the rounds in Italy at the time.
I think there's always been justification for war. You look at Egyptian culture, you look at the Trojan War, someone is always justifying why they went and killed their neighbour. Whether it be over land, sales pitch, getting a woman back, whether you blame the gods, there's always a justification for. So I think it's not a necessarily Roman thing, the casus belli. I think it's very much a human nature to turn around and go, oh well, I had very good reasons for doing what I did, even if they're completely false. Even if you're talking to a thief or a criminal, they'll come up with reasons for why they did it. Society's to blame, gov. And so I think that idea of finding reasons and justified reasons for doing so is very much a part of it. But the idea that Rome builds an empire in self-defense because, if you've got a treaty breaker and you defeat that treaty breaker, you can re-establish the border where it was. If you're self-defending, you don't then aggressively annex and massacre those peoples. That's not self-defense. So I think the picture painting of what Rome was doing is different. So, yes, they've justified what they did, but self-defense is a very slim reason.
Shall we have a look at how Rome made war? Would we be right in saying that if you look to the north and to the south, you've got the Gauls and the Italian Greeks Gauls to the north and the Italian Greeks to the south. They're very different ways of very different an opponent that fights in very different ways to the north and to the south. And didn't Rome fight them in the same manner, or do we not know? Shall I pose you a different question that might?
No, well, it's again very much debated. The Camillan reforms. How did the Roman military system come about, as Polybius describes it, for the Second Punic War? We have an attempt in this issue to make an argument that Rome sort of got the various elements from the cultures around it. But it's certainly not the only explanation that's ever been given for how it came about. The traditional picture is more, that the Romans also fought in a phalanx, and at some point they just started to split it up. This article seems to make more of a argument that it was always much more a flexible fighting method, which is also in that book that the Roman Republic at War, I think, that I reviewed a couple months ago, and it's based on the fact that instead of if you think of the classical city-state, which is sort of very much a pyramid, sort of top down with maybe a tyrant or some kind of ruling class at the top and goes down, and then you have a phalanx of everybody going out, where in Rome you have these members of the elite that all have their own retinue, and they take their retinue out for a fight, and if the whole city goes, it becomes more of a national effort. There's still that undercurrent of all these groups of elite with their clients going out into combat, and that's where you get these smaller groups from. Also related possibly to the fighting methods of the peoples around them. Is there ever any conclusive evidence? Probably not. But it keeps us busy and fascinated.
Employment. Yeah.
Well. Bashmakov from Facebook asks, is there a series of events that leads to the transformation of the early Roman military order? And what influence do they have? I would add to that, can you start at the start of the period and get to the end of the period, and is there evidence to suggest they started in one way and ended in another?
I think that's you'd have to listen probably to the podcast that goes with issue 7.3, because I think that deals with the Battle of the Allia, where I think Rome sort of tried to do what has been interpreted as a sort of a phalanx, and then just get swept aside, and that was it. And here comes the sack of Rome. And at the end of the period, they certainly do not seem to work. That's the same way. In the Samnite Wars, like the Battle of Sentinum, we have legions. Clearly, there's been a change at that point. If does everybody fight? Do you have the classic hastati, principes, and triaria? Probably not yet, but that's the beginning. There's the end, and how exactly it changes and when it changes.
We rely too much on Polybius for that, though, and later writers that whether you're actually pushing back ideas that do not belong in that time frame.
That's exactly the problem,
we
yes.
have no idea.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, of course, is that what happens at several stages of Roman history is one man gets given the credit for what could have been generations or very slow development, and at some point the change is in place, and it's like, oh, these are the reforms of Camillus. No, these are the reforms of Marius. No, these are the reforms of Julius Caesar. And so they could have easily been a longer term thing that somehow later gets called, well, where's a convenient battle where those could have all been put in place by a great general who saved our ass again. They were all him, and he introduced them all at once as a radical change. And again, we don't have the source material to tell us. We do have some source material that has a phrase that may be misleading, referring to an earlier battle, like phalanx gets used. I think even Homer uses the term phalanx, but it means different things at different periods. But we go, ooh, latch onto that word, and therefore these reforms are in place.
Is this just a bunch of guys standing in sort of a line with a spear and a shield, or is this
Yeah. Is this wives sending out their bored husbands to just get rid of some energy? Apparently not.
It also depends in terms of looking at individuals again. You can say broad sweeps of history, this is when something comes in. But again, you're dealing with militias who are going out under leaders who are appointed for single commands here and there. Whether these individuals are, it's purely their personal style of command that actually dictates the formations that they create. And who's to say that, these things don't wash back and forth over time. It's just the fad that they're going through before it finally settles down.
Can you imagine that if, like soccer coaches, like no, I'm old-fashioned. We're going to fight in a phalanx today, but last year we were fighting in like a legion. It was like, I don't believe in that. So my 4-4-2 defense, we're going to go back and we're actually going to fight in the heroic style where each one of you is going to take on an individual opponent. No, wait, what?
But that's the reforms by Louis van Gaal, man. You can't,
Shall we get on to the guns, germs, and steel?
What's the Roman equivalent, since they had the first but not the second or the third?
I don't know.
The other way around, maybe.
It's the spirit of it.
Iron bugs and ballistic bolts. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, we presume that the Germans were around.
So, again, another question from one of our patrons. If you like the show and would like to tip us $1 or $2, that's patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. Alejandro asks, I'm a fan of the book Guns, Germs and Steel, which you may know tries to use environmental factors to explain cultural technological development. In that vein, do you guys think Rome's ultimate victory has to do with environmental factors? Or is Italy somewhat more homogeneous in environment and Rome's victory had more to do with the chance or with the individual involved? I tried to power watch the documentary before we got started, and I wondered if it was it's hugely broadly sweeping in his ideas. It's Jared Diamond, and he seemed to, I don't know if this is reflected in the book, but certainly the documentary seems to sort of jump from the Stone Age to the Spanish conquering South America. So we'll be breaking new ground, possibly discussing this in looking at Rome.
I think that Alejandro is asking a great question. It's essentially a big history question that is, as military historians, we tend to get lost in the weeds a lot about, when was the Gladius Hispaniensis first adopted? How did the Greek phalanx actually fight? Was it a push? Did they stand at a distance from each other and trade blows? But this is asking via guns, germs, and steel is where there are some sort of underlying factors that became the basis for Roman expansion and conquest in this period. And the nutshell version of guns, germs, and steel there's a lot in that book. It's a very deep book. Is that environmental factors made Eurasians much more populous and dominant. That is, they had more access to domesticatable species of plants, domesticatable species of animals, and effectively, because they could grow crops and feed more people, they expanded, they became bigger and more powerful than the peoples of Africa or the Americas. That is not directly applicable to Rome in our period, which I'm going to say would be, say, the 5th century through the 3rd centuries BC. What I have found is that there were underlying reasons why I think Rome succeeded, and we touched upon several of them earlier in this podcast. For example, population. The Romans had a lot of people, and they were constantly able to replenish their armies even after very severe defeats. That is not something that is easily measured or explained, but essentially it is important to note that because the Romans had a large population base to work with, they could produce legion after legion and keep going at an enemy. Relating more to the big history aspect of Roman expansion, you might want to look up a book called War and Peace and War. It's subtitled The Life Cycle of Imperial Nations, and it's by Peter Turchin. He devotes actually at least 2 chapters to Rome itself, one of which is about the expansion of Rome. And the concepts that he uses to explain why Rome became so powerful, it became the imperial nation that it was that it was cited upon what he called a meta-ethnic frontier. That is, it's not merely that they were on a frontier with some other people, but they were on a fault line between themselves and some very different peoples. So, for example, just north of Rome were the Etruscans. 12 miles away was the city of Veii. That became the original meta-ethnic frontier for the Romans and made them into a warlike people. But even more important than the Etruscans were the Gauls. That is, the same Gauls who sacked Rome in sometime around 390 BC. They remained as the bogeyman for the Romans for centuries afterwards, and the Romans were determined never to allow that sack to happen again. They were also very aggressive, in fighting the Gauls, and they were essentially on a permanent war footing for all of their early history because of that. There are some another concept that Turchin brings up is asabiya. It's an Arabic word. It means cohesiveness, solidarity, group feeling. He takes that from the historian Ibn Khaldun, and what he says with asabiya is that peoples, cities, states, nations that have high asabiya, that is, they have the ability to cooperate, a sense of solidarity, the willingness to die for each other. States with high asabiya will be more resilient when times are bad, as the Romans were, and also more powerful as they try and expand and come into competition with peoples with low asabiya. That is, a people who are cohesive will generally triumph over people who are not cohesive, that don't want to fight to the death, that don't want to keep the war going past the point of reason. The Romans were famous for just not giving up. They would fight until they achieved victory, with probably the most famous examples being the First and Second Punic Wars, where these wars were pursued long past any point where maybe a rational, I'm putting that word rational in quotes, actor would have sought peace. The Romans would have none of that, and they fought to the bitter end. The Romans also, as we mentioned earlier, they were open to newcomers. They were, broadly speaking, more generous with citizenship and being allowed into the Roman fold than most other peoples, it seems, or at least imperial peoples, compared to, say, the Athenians and the Spartans. That was, I think, a factor in their success. They were also willing to adopt the military techniques of foreign peoples. So, for example, probably there is a relationship between the tactics of the Samnites, who tended to fight in hilly country in open order, and the Roman adoption of perhaps manipular tactics, where smaller units would be fighting more separated from their neighbors. They also adopted apparently the gladius from the Spaniards, maybe the pilum too from the Samnites. It seems that all of these things, these aren't really answers that you can say, okay, these are what made the Romans successful. But what it was is that it's more of an impressionistic idea, is to help explain some of the reasons why the Romans became so powerful and why they triumphed in the end. So all of these things, group solidarity, a large population base, openness to new military ideas, things like that made the Romans powerful. So when I try to compare it to something like Guns, Germs, and Steel, Jared Diamond is talking about a period of time that far predates the Roman era. That is, he's talking essentially about the Neolithic farming revolution and why populations in various parts of the world became much more populous. That doesn't quite have relevance to Rome, except in the sense to say that the Romans were part of that great revolution. But the Romans themselves were, I think, successful for the reasons that I just enunciated.
Yeah, I think we tend to think of, when we think of Roman dominance, we tend to think of the Roman military revolutions, plural, whether it be the Pilum, whether it be the legion, whether it be the Manipular legion, whether it be the, the Triarii and the last line of defense and all that sort of thing. We tend to be told that it's a revolution in military tactics, which, it's probably more of an evolution and a toing and froing and a two steps forward, one step back kind of thing. But I think the other thing is, of course, that the Germs, Guns and Steel talks about the Fertile Crescent, and the Sahara stopped people from moving in the Great Rift Valley in Africa and the Nile Valley in Egypt. So one of the things you've got in Northern Europe in the Roman period is a sort of a geographical cohesiveness. There's no real inhospitable region to stop people from moving, whereas in the Nile and in the Fertile Crescent there are. So the fact is that you can have people moving south, you can have people moving north, even though it is a peninsula. It is a fertile land that welcomes invaders, shall we say, and continues to do so for centuries, millennia even, you could argue. And I think the other thing is that what you get in weird ways is almost in reverse. That whereas the book talks about when the Spanish invasion of South America happened, and 95% of the population, they estimate, died from smallpox, measles, and influenza, and similarly that happened when the white man came to Australia. You've also got the fact that when an army comes back from an Eastern war, they bring plague, which wipes out huge amounts of the Roman population. And that continues through the centuries, all the way down to World War I, when the military populations came back from World War I, they wiped out millions more people, certainly in New Zealand and Australia, from bringing back the flus from the north, and then you had the great influenza epidemic. So in many ways, it's almost the reverse. That rather than you using germs of conquest, so to speak, when you come back from military campaigns, the germs that you've brought with you devastate your native population. So
I'm inclined to agree that the Romans suffered much more from germs than it ever benefited from them. That being said, this tended to occur much long after our period. That is, the first truly horrific plague that the Romans would suffer came in 165 AD during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. So they had come back from the Syrian War, and many people died.
The thing is, they mentioned at Dyrrachium, I think. Caesar mentions that there's and the problem is we get sickness mentioned. We don't get told how bad it is. And of course, the great Athenian plague, which is more to deal with the masses of people sort of shoved into a small space.
True. That plague, though, as per Thucydides, started in the East, too. That was also... So the crowding did not help, and probably made it more conducive to the spread. But that also came from elsewhere, too. The one book that I can recommend very highly, Plagues and Peoples by William H. McNeill. It's another one of those big history books that I think that would be very interesting to.
There's a new one out as well called Plague of War by Jennifer Roberts. It came out last year, I think. So
one of the things that McNeill makes very clear is that the Mediterranean populations up to sometime around 200 BC were largely untroubled by most of the most diseases. For example, if you go by the writings of Hippocrates, there's no evidence that he knew what measles or smallpox were. So these were populations that had still not encountered diseases that are now considered endemic in the modern world. I think that what we see with germs, at least, and the Romans, I don't think it affected the Romans in terms of the conquest of the Italian peninsula. I think that it had more to do with the ultimate decline and fall of the Roman Empire, because there are periodic outbreaks of plague, which plague is a catch-all term for all sorts of undesignated ailments. That being said, there was the Antonine plague of 160s. There was the plague in the middle of the 3rd century, and they continued onward. There was the famous plague of Justinian in the 6th century. So it hollowed out a lot of the cities of the ancient Roman Empire. But it's not so much explaining why the Romans conquered Italy. It's more, why did the empire fall centuries later?
So we have a couple of questions from Facebook to go. If people want to find us on Facebook, you can find us on Facebook at Ancient Warfare Magazine or the History Network. We put call out for questions before the show. So if you can find us there, give us a like, and you'll see when our question call comes out. So, Lewis on Facebook, how would you rank Rome's conflict with the Samnites against their other historical conflicts? For example, did they pose the same kind of existential threat that Carthage did in the Punic Wars, or were the conflicts made to be more important than they actually were by historians?
Well, you could say that Carthage probably was not an existential threat for Rome. It was the other way around. But I don't think the Carthaginians were ever planning to take over Rome. Whereas maybe the Samnites, that the 4th century probably could have gone the other way around too.
Rome was smaller and weaker in the 4th century BC than it was in the... Right.
Yeah, and the competition was right next door instead of, still across the sea.
I think, again, we've got the hindsight issue that, look what Rome became. Wow. As opposed to Rome was wiped out by the Samnites, and we're reading Samnite history, in which case it was like there was this tiny little conflict with their northern neighbor and they defeated them. So I think that's part of it. So I suppose, in terms of existential threat, closer, and it could have led to the absorption of Rome into the Samnite Empire as opposed to the other way. So you could say in that regard, but you could turn around and say, well, what if Remus had won? So,
Then they would have had a very strange meeting in the 50s BC when they finally came up to the Remi in northern France.
Exactly.
You are the Remi, but we are the Remi.
We must be culturally linked. Let's make up a myth. Yes.
With Carthage, I think it's a bigger conflict because it's sort of narrowed down to two bigger powers as well by that stage. I mean, when it's Samnites, there are still more players active in Italy at the same time.
So shall we draw to a close with our final question once more from Facebook, from Lon on Facebook, who would like to know about how Roman patrician officers received any education in military tactics, if at all. The professionalism of the leadership.
Well, I think we've touched on a part of it firstly, which is, of course, the culture of warrior status, that being a great warrior, as a patrician, you would be expected to lead men. So there would be a certain amount of familial, this is what you do, son, this is how you do it, this is how you lead men in battle. There'd be some of that. There would also then be, the traditional view, of course, is that the untrained patricians would be appointed to sort of positions within the army, but for lack of a better term, the centurions and things like that would do more of the work, and you would simply learn your trade as the tribunes, and then and even some argue that the legates might do the same, that they would be appointed and they would just allow the men who knew what they were doing to do what they were doing. At an earlier phase where you haven't got a standing army, you're relying on veterans who know what they're doing. And again, it comes back to what we were talking about before. If this warfare was standardized, then people knew what they were doing anyway, and generals, not redundant, but certainly not necessary. If it's far more changeable, then obviously you've got things happening. And again, coming back to if there are these revolutions of military technology and tactics, who's driving those, and how do they get the new officers on board with this is the way we do things? So is there a revolution? Literarily, Homer. Always read your Homer. Homer tells you everything you ever need to know, even to this day. It
would cut down so much on textbooks if everybody just followed Homer.
Look, absolutely. If you want to know how to work Facebook, it's in Homer. And then, of course, there are handbooks as well, which begin in the Greek-speaking world around about the time of the Peloponnesian War, and in the 4th century onwards, where there are books of how to be a general and how to do this and how to survive under siege and how to conduct a siege and how to be a cavalry officer. So there's a whole raft of ways in to be a commander. If you were asking a Roman, they would probably turn around and talk about the fact that it was about being a good man, and that would therefore make you a good general.
And knowing when to timely sacrifice yourself, so that
of course, sacrifice and propitiating the gods and doing the correct services, and reading the auguries correctly. There's basically lots of ways out if you did badly, and lots of ways and lots of other people to blame if it went wrong. But I think it's a mishmash of all those things. And again, one of the amazing things about Rome's history is that Rome eventually always ends up with a commander who's able to get the job done either spectacularly or through determination or thinking outside the box.
It comes down to the Roman commanders generally. I mean, there's such a small number of families that end up contributing to that hierarchy as well, in terms of the Senate and whatnot, that ultimately it can't always be down to their capacity as a leader. It has to come through the main body of troops to a certain extent in order for Rome to always have that level of success.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the things that's always fascinating about the Battle of Cannae to me is, of course, that the Romans are winning because they're moving forward, and then they get double enveloped. It's like, oh, what went wrong in there? That's not right. That's not how battles are lost. So there's exactly. There's a sort of a communal knowledge of how to fight wars, and I think that again, 60 years of warfare is going to create an amazing base of veterans who know how to fight. By the end of those Samnite wars, you've got an entirely new generation, if not two generations, of Roman legionaries, to call them that. So it's absolutely a cultural knowledge of 2 or 3 generations of Roman men who know how to fight wars, which is, in a way, an irreplaceable asset that you don't generally get it, and Rome keeps it in its military organisation of later centuries, that you retain that kind of knowledge through your centurion base.
Again, why they keep on a roll after the Punic Wars, after the Second Punic War, in terms of keep going on to Greece and whatnot. They've got that roll up. They've got year after year of experience and number of veterans available.
So the commanders who are appointed for 1 year and 1 year only really become not irrelevant, but they're certainly largely. I don't want to use the word irrelevant again.
Safe pair of hands.
Yeah, and in many ways, even when you have the crises of the late 2nd century, the Roman generals are exceptional because they lead to the massacres of so many Roman armies, and that allows Marius to say, well, I know how to do this. And probably they do that through they meddle, and they go for glory, and they don't listen to experienced troops. Whereas for the most part, you could have any commander and the Roman army would do what the Roman army needs to do.
Right, Murray, chaps, let's leave it there. I think we've answered all the listeners' questions. I'm sorry if we've missed any. Don't forget to keep your eyes peeled on Facebook or Patreon, patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. We put the call out for questions usually the week before we record an episode. So thank you to Jasper, Murray, Mark, and Mark. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.